She hadn't smiled since her mother's death, until a poor boy's silly joke made the millionaire's daughter laugh. Emily sat on the wooden bench outside the kindergarten, her little hands folded tightly in her lap as if she were afraid that if she let go, everything inside her would fall apart. The hem of her pink dress with tiny flowers was wrinkled from how hard she clutched it, and her small shoes barely touched the ground as she swung them gently back and forth. She looked so small and fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been forgotten in the corner of a dusty room. Her golden hair was neatly brushed, but even the sunlight that glinted on it could not bring warmth to her expression. Her big blue eyes, usually a child's window to joy, were dull and heavy, filled with a sorrow that belonged to someone far older than 5 years old. 6 months had passed since her mother's death, but for Emily, it felt as if time had stopped entirely. Days blurred together, the world seemed muted and colorless. She had not laughed since the day she last saw her mother's face, and her once cheerful chatter had been replaced with silence that weighed on everyone around her. Other children avoided her, not out of cruelty but because they did not know how to bridge the invisible wall she had built around herself. To them, she was the sad girl, the one who never played, never smiled, the one who seemed to belong to another, distant world. Her father, Michael, stood nearby, pretending to look at his phone while his eyes remained glued to his daughter. He was a man of presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that once made people tremble in boardrooms, but now they softened every time they fell on Emily. He wore his usual light blue suit, immaculately pressed, but it felt more like armor than clothing, something to shield himself from the crushing emptiness of loss. Michael had built empires, turned failing companies into success stories, and carried the weight of thousands of employees' futures on his shoulders, yet nothing had prepared him for the sight of his little girl fading into silence before his eyes. He remembered how different she had been when her mother was alive. Emily had filled every room with laughter. She loved to run into his office, twirling in her dresses and demanding that he put away his papers just to chase her around the desk. He used to think her laughter was background music to his life, something permanent and unshakable, but when his wife died, that laughter vanished, and the silence that followed cut deeper than any business failure ever could. Michael had tried everything he could think of to bring some spark back into Emily's eyes. He bought her dolls, stuffed animals, even a pony. He hired teachers who read her stories and therapists who spoke in soft voices. He took her on trips to the park, held her hand through crowded streets, and promised her anything she wanted, but nothing worked. The toys remained untouched, the pony grazed alone, the books stayed closed. Emily would sit quietly, watching the world move on without her, and Michael, for all his power and wealth, felt helpless in a way that terrified him. That morning was no different. The children spilled into the playground, their laughter echoing through the yard, their colorful clothes bright against the gray sky. Emily sat alone on the bench, her head slightly bowed, her small fingers still clutching the fabric of her dress. No one approached her, though some of the children looked over curiously, whispering to each other before running back into their games. Michael's chest tightened as he watched her, realizing how much she had withdrawn from the world. She was only 5 years old, yet she carried herself like someone who had already lived through a lifetime of grief. As he leaned against the fence, he thought about how unfair it all was. His wife had been the light of their home, the one who knew how to make Emily laugh even when she was in tears. He had been the strong one, the provider, the figure in the background, while his wife was the heart. Without her, Michael was lost, and Emily was drifting further away with every passing day. He felt powerless, something he had never felt in the corporate world, and that helplessness gnawed at him until he wondered if he would ever hear his daughters laugh again. When the bell rang and teachers began calling the children inside, Emily stayed rooted to her bench. She did not move until one of the teachers gently touched her shoulder, urging her along. She obeyed silently, her steps small and reluctant. Michael's gaze followed her until she disappeared into the building, his heart aching with a longing he could not name. He prayed silently, not to restore his old life but simply to hear the sound of his daughter's laughter once more, even for just a second. Michael returned that afternoon earlier than usual, his work phone buzzing endlessly in his pocket, though for once he ignored it. His mind was too heavy with thoughts of Emily. He had watched her shuffle into the building that morning like a small shadow, and the image clung to him all day, haunting him during meetings and in the back seat of his car. By the time he arrived to pick her up, the playground was alive again with children shouting, chasing each other, and filling the air with bursts of joy. It was as though the entire world had color and sound except for the small corner where Emily sat quietly by herself. She was perched at the far edge of the playground, sitting on the grass with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring at the ground as if searching for something invisible there. Michael's chest ached as he approached, but before he could reach her, he noticed a boy walking over. The child's clothes were worn, an oversized gray t-shirt with a faded dinosaur print and blue jeans that looked as though they had belonged to someone older before him. His sneakers were scuffed and mismatched in color, and his hair was a bit messy, but his brown eyes shone with a kind of mischief and warmth. He moved with the confidence of someone who did not care about what others thought, and Michael instantly recognized the contrast between the boy's spirit and Emily's silence. The boy crouched in front of Emily and tapped his chest with his finger where the dinosaur print was stretched. "Look," he said in a voice filled with amusement, "isn't this the funniest dinosaur you've ever seen?" He pushed his belly out slightly, making the dinosaur bend in a ridiculous shape, and then made a silly growl, crossing his eyes until he almost toppled over. Michael froze, standing a short distance away, not wanting to interrupt. He had never seen anyone approach Emily like that, as if her sadness wasn't a wall too high to climb. Emily lifted her gaze slowly, her blue eyes filled with hesitation. At first she looked at him as she did with everyone else, with the same empty stare, as though she were already preparing to retreat back into silence. The boy didn't falter. He put his arms up like a dinosaur, stomped around in circles, and let out another exaggerated growl before suddenly pretending to fall backward onto the grass. A few of the children nearby stopped to watch, some giggling, but Emily sat unmoving, her face unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, her lips began to twitch. She lowered her gaze to her knees again as if fighting something deep within herself. The boy noticed, and instead of speaking, he tilted his head, giving her the most ridiculous cross-eyed look he could manage. Emily's small shoulders shook once, a tiny sound escaping her throat like a broken sigh. But it wasn't a sigh, it was the fragile start of laughter. She tried to cover her mouth, as if ashamed of the sound, but then another giggle slipped through, and suddenly, like water breaking through a dam, she was laughing. It was quiet at first, unsteady and foreign, but within seconds it grew into the kind of sweet, unguarded laughter that children are meant to have. The other children looked in astonishment, whispering to each other because none of them had ever seen Emily laugh. The boy, pleased with himself, simply grinned and flopped onto the grass beside her, proud that his silly dinosaur had done the impossible. Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. He had not heard that sound in months, not since his wife's last day. His eyes stung, and before he knew it, he was moving toward them. Dropping down onto one knee beside Emily, he gently touched her arm and whispered with disbelief, "You're laughing? How is this possible?" His voice cracked, and for the first time in a long while, Emily turned to him with a softness in her face he thought was lost forever. She pointed shyly at the boy and murmured, "He showed me a funny dinosaur." Michael looked at the boy, and their eyes met for a fleeting moment. The CEO, a man used to commanding entire rooms of executives, felt speechless before this child in a worn t-shirt who had achieved what money and power never could. In that instant, Michael knew something extraordinary had begun, though he could not yet understand just how much this moment would change all of their lives. The ride home that evening was unlike any Michael had experienced in months. Emily sat in the back seat, her small hands still holding the hem of her pink dress, but her face was different now. She wasn't smiling broadly, nor was she speaking much, but every so often a tiny spark would flicker in her expression, a faint trace of the laughter that had burst out of her in the playground. Michael kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, almost afraid that if he blinked, it would vanish. He drove more slowly than usual, wanting to prolong the moment, to let the quiet air of the car be filled with the afterglow of her laughter. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like he was driving home with a ghost of his daughter, but with a child who was still capable of joy. His mind, however, would not rest. He thought of the boy, his clothes worn and his shoes nearly falling apart, yet carrying something far greater than anything money could buy, the ability to reach his daughter's heart. The memory of Emily's laugh echoed in Michael's chest, but it was intertwined with questions. Who was the boy? Where did he come from? And how had he, in a matter of minutes, managed to do what therapists, teachers, and even Michael himself had failed at for months? When they reached home, Emily climbed out of the car and walked inside slowly, clutching her small teddy bear by the arm. Michael followed, still deep in thought, his mind replaying the boy's face over and over. At dinner, Emily was quiet again, but she ate more than she usually did, and her gaze was less distant. Michael found himself watching her every move, searching for signs that the boy's impact had not been a fleeting miracle. After she went to bed, he stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her sleep. Her chest rose and fell in steady breaths, and though her eyes were closed, her face seemed softer, less weighed down by grief. He whispered into the silence of the room, "I heard you laugh today. Your mother would be so happy." The next morning, when he brought Emily back to the kindergarten, Michael could not stop his eyes from searching the playground. He saw the boy immediately. He was standing near the fence, balancing on one foot while holding a stick, pretending it was a sword. Other children ran past him, but he seemed content with his own little game. His gray dinosaur shirt was the same, the fabric stretched and faded, and Michael felt a pang in his chest. Here was a child with so little, yet he carried himself with a confidence that outshone everyone around him. Emily noticed him too. She hesitated, her small body leaning closer to her father as if unsure whether to approach. Michael knelt beside her and spoke softly. "Do you want to go say hi?" She looked at him with uncertainty, but then her eyes flickered back to the boy, and slowly, almost timidly, she nodded. Michael gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, watching as she walked across the grass with small, careful steps. The boy looked up as Emily stopped in front of him. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if deciding whether this was real or just some fragile accident of yesterday. Then the boy lifted the stick above his head dramatically and declared, "I am the king of the dinosaurs. But you can be the queen if you want." Emily blinked, her lips parting slightly, and though she didn't laugh, her eyes softened, the tiniest light flickering there again. She shook her head, but the corners of her mouth curved upward, just enough to make Michael's heart leap. Michael stood in the distance, overwhelmed. It was clear now that what had happened yesterday wasn't luck. This boy, with his messy hair and patched clothes, had opened a door into his daughter's locked heart. Michael felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months: hope. He understood then that his daughter's healing wasn't going to come from doctors or toys or carefully planned distractions. It would come from something far simpler, something unexplainable. It would come from connection, from a bond born in innocence and laughter. And though Michael didn't yet know what role this boy would play in their lives, he realized that he had just witnessed the beginning of something that would change everything. Michael found it impossible to concentrate on work over the following days. Board meetings stretched on endlessly, charts and financial projections blurred together, and even the sharp voices of executives vying for his approval failed to penetrate the fog of his thoughts. He kept seeing the boy's face, the way Emily had looked at him, the cautious warmth that had returned to her eyes for the first time since her mother's death. It consumed him. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with resources, influence, or relentless effort, but this was different. He had poured everything into helping Emily heal, therapy sessions with the most recommended child psychologists, tutors trained to work with grieving children, endless reassurances whispered into her ear at night, and yet none of it had drawn out her laughter. A boy from nowhere, wearing a worn-out dinosaur shirt, had done it in seconds. That evening, Michael sat in his office at home long after Emily had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. On his desk lay a small framed photograph of his late wife holding Emily in her arms, their faces glowing with happiness. He touched the edge of the frame with trembling fingers and whispered to the still air, "She laughed again. Can you believe it? She really laughed." His voice cracked, and he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He felt torn, grateful beyond words, but also unsettled. How had he, with all his wealth and power, been unable to give his daughter what this boy had provided effortlessly? The next day, determined to understand more, he lingered at the kindergarten after dropping Emily off. He stood outside the fence, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his eyes were fixed on the children. Emily stayed close to the wall at first, holding her small teddy bear, while the boy darted around, gathering sticks and rocks, inventing games that drew in other children. It was obvious that he was not the most popular kid. Some of the wealthier children looked at him with disdain, whispering and giggling at his worn shoes and faded clothes. But he didn't seem to care, and there was a freedom in that which fascinated Michael. Then Emily moved closer to him. The boy noticed, grinned, and waved her over without hesitation. Soon, the two were sitting side by side, drawing shapes in the dirt with sticks. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just that Emily was engaging, she was choosing to. When Emily came home that afternoon, her mood was lighter. She sat at the dinner table and spoke in a soft voice about how the boy had made a joke about dinosaurs eating broccoli, which made her giggle again. Michael nearly dropped his fork hearing her speak about someone other than her mother for the first time in so long. He asked casually, "What's his name?" Emily looked up from her plate and answered, "Daniel." She said it with a gentleness that made Michael's throat ache, as if the boy's name already carried weight in her heart. Over the next week, Michael watched a transformation begin. Emily started waking up with less reluctance, sometimes even with a quiet hum on her lips. She still had her moments of silence, her lingering grief, but there was color returning to her life, a softness that hadn't been there before. Michael felt both relieved and unsettled, as though life was pushing him into uncharted waters. He knew he needed to learn more about Daniel, not only out of gratitude but also out of curiosity. Who was this boy who had managed to unlock a part of Emily he thought was lost forever? And why did Michael feel that something far bigger than coincidence had brought them together? Late one evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Michael stood by her doorway, watching her peaceful face illuminated by the soft glow of her nightlight. He whispered, "If this boy is the reason you're smiling again, then I have to know why. I have to understand." For the first time in months, he felt a surge of determination that wasn't tied to profit margins or corporate battles but to something far more fragile and important. He would find out who Daniel was, and somehow, he would repay what the boy had unknowingly given him. What Michael didn't realize was that his search for answers would unravel far more than he expected, exposing truths about Daniel, about himself, and about the world he had built around Emily since her mother's death. Michael began his quiet investigation with a careful approach. He didn't want to alarm Emily, nor did he want to make the boy feel as though he was being examined under a microscope, but his mind refused to rest. He arranged his schedule to allow him to drop Emily off later and pick her up earlier, always observing Daniel from a distance. What struck him most was the boy's resilience. While other children had parents who picked them up in expensive cars, Daniel often waited until the very end, sitting patiently on the curb with his battered backpack resting against his knees. Sometimes a woman would arrive in a small, rusted sedan that coughed as it pulled up, and Daniel would run to her, his smile so bright that it disguised the exhaustion on her face. Michael's sharp eyes caught every detail, the woman's faded uniform, her tired posture, the way Daniel took her hand as if he were the one giving her strength instead of the other way around. Michael's curiosity deepened when he noticed that Daniel rarely had snacks during breaks, often pretending he wasn't hungry while the other children unwrapped colorful packages of food. Instead, he would make Emily laugh by inventing stories about the shapes of clouds or pretending that the playground equipment was part of a dinosaur kingdom. It wasn't the food or the toys that mattered to him, it was imagination, joy, and connection. Watching the boy stirred something in Michael, a reminder of his own childhood before success and wealth consumed his days. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Michael called one of his trusted assistants and asked discreetly for information. He didn't want to invade the boy's life harshly, but he needed to know more about the circumstances surrounding Daniel. Within a day, the reports arrived. Michael read them late at night in his study, and the more he learned, the more conflicted he felt. Daniel's father had left years ago, leaving his mother to raise him alone. She worked 2 jobs, mostly night shifts at a local diner and cleaning offices in the early mornings, barely scraping together enough to keep a roof over their heads. They lived in a small apartment in a struggling neighborhood, and though bills were often late, the woman had somehow managed to keep Daniel in school. There were no complaints of neglect, only whispers of admiration from neighbors about how much love the boy carried for his mother and how determined he was to protect her. Michael sat in silence after finishing the report. He stared at the stack of papers, his mind churning. The contrast between Emily's world and Daniel's was impossible to ignore. His daughter lived in a house filled with every comfort imaginable, yet she had been locked away in her grief, unreachable despite all the resources surrounding her. Daniel, who had so little, radiated warmth and resilience powerful enough to touch a girl drowning in sorrow. Michael felt humbled, even unsettled, as if the foundation of his own beliefs was being challenged. The next day, when he arrived early at the kindergarten, he found Daniel sitting alone by the sandbox, humming softly while drawing in the dirt with a stick. Emily had gone inside to collect her things, leaving Michael with a rare moment to approach. He crouched down beside the boy, his tailored suit looking out of place in the dusty playground. Daniel glanced up at him with wide brown eyes, curious but not afraid. Michael hesitated, then asked gently, "You made my daughter laugh the other day. Do you know how special that is?" The boy tilted his head, as though unsure how to respond, then gave a small shrug. "She looked sad. I just wanted her to smile. My mom says sometimes people just need to know they're not alone." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat at the simplicity of the answer. He realized that this boy was not trying to impress anyone, nor was he aware of the weight of what he had done. His kindness was natural, instinctive, born out of love and hardship. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card, intending to hand it over, but he stopped. This wasn't the time. The boy didn't need to be treated like a project or a charity case. He needed to be respected for who he was, for the quiet strength he carried. Michael placed the card back in his pocket and instead said, "You're a remarkable kid, Daniel. Don't ever forget that." Later that evening, when Michael tucked Emily into bed, she whispered sleepily, "Daddy, Daniel is funny. He makes me feel, not so sad." The words pierced his heart, raw and honest, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead, his voice trembling as he replied, "I know, sweetheart. He's a good friend." He left her room with a heaviness that was different from grief. It was the weight of realization, the growing awareness that perhaps fate had brought Daniel into their lives for a reason far beyond what he could yet comprehend. For the first time, Michael began to wonder if helping Emily heal wasn't just about what he could do for her, but also about what he could learn from a little boy who had already taught her more in days than Michael had managed in months. Michael could not shake the conversation he had with Daniel out of his mind. The boy's words echoed with a simplicity that felt more profound than anything the countless therapists or consultants had ever offered him. That night he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his late wife. She had been the one who had taught him that love and presence mattered more than any material thing, and yet, after her death, he had drowned himself in work and hired help instead of listening to that lesson. Emily's sadness had become a mirror of his own, and he realized with a pang of guilt that he had been so determined to fix her pain with solutions that could be bought that he had overlooked the human connection she needed most. The following week Michael deliberately sought moments to observe Daniel more closely, not out of suspicion but from a growing sense of respect. One afternoon, after the children had finished their playtime, He watched as Daniel carefully tied the shoelaces of a younger child who was struggling and then shared his worn-out pencil with another who had broken theirs. It was never done with showiness or the need for acknowledgement. The boy simply did what was needed, as though kindness was woven into him as naturally as breathing. The sight of it stirred something raw inside Michael, an ache that reminded him of how much he wanted Emily to grow up surrounded by such selflessness. It was during pickup time one rainy day that Michael finally encountered Daniel's mother up close. The old car had broken down in the parking lot, smoke rising from under the hood as she stood in the rain trying to coax the engine back to life. Daniel was holding an umbrella over her, his small arm stretched high, shielding her while he got soaked himself. Without thinking, Michael stepped forward, his expensive shoes splashing in puddles, and offered assistance. She looked up, startled to see the CEO whose name she surely knew, and hesitated as though unsure whether to accept help. Michael knelt beside the car, his suit dampened, and worked with her until the engine coughed back to life. Daniel's mother thanked him quietly, her voice tired but kind, and Michael caught a glimpse of the same strength in her eyes that he saw in her son. That night, as he told Emily a bedtime story, Michael found himself speaking more softly, allowing pauses for her to ask questions instead of rushing through as he often did when distracted by work. She snuggled closer to him, and he realized with a shock that she hadn't done that in months. He kissed the top of her head and thought, almost with a sense of awe, that Daniel's presence was already reshaping the way he related to his daughter. It wasn't about the boy replacing anything or anyone, but about reminding both of them what it meant to be connected, to care, to laugh even in the shadow of loss. Over the coming days Michael wrestled with thoughts that were new and unsettling. He began to question whether his wealth had insulated Emily not only from hardship but also from the small, essential experiences that taught resilience and compassion. Daniel had little, yet he seemed rich in qualities that Michael feared he could never teach his daughter on his own. The idea of these two children forming a bond seemed less like coincidence and more like something he was meant to protect and nurture. Late one evening Michael returned to his office, where the photo of his wife still stood. He poured himself a glass of water, sat heavily in his chair, and whispered, "She's laughing again. And it's because of him. I don't know what to do, but I know I can't ignore it." His voice cracked, and for the first time in a long while, tears filled his eyes, not only from grief but from the overwhelming sense that perhaps life had given him and Emily an unexpected second chance through a boy who had appeared in the unlikeliest of ways. What Michael didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning, and that the path ahead would challenge him not just as a father but as a man who would have to decide how far he was willing to go to honor the gift that Daniel had given his daughter. Michael's resolve to better understand the strange bond between Emily and Daniel deepened into action when the kindergarten announced a small spring showcase where the children would present skits, songs, and little performances for their parents. For most families it was an ordinary event, but for Michael it carried a weight far greater. He had not seen Emily on a stage since before her mother's passing, when she used to twirl in her little dresses while her mother clapped and laughed in the audience. After the tragedy, Emily had refused to participate in anything public, her shyness and grief locking her away. When Emily timidly told him that she and Daniel were planning to perform a small skit together, Michael felt his chest tighten with both fear and hope. He promised her he would be there, sitting in the front row, no matter what. The night of the showcase arrived, and the modest auditorium of the kindergarten buzzed with chatter. Parents carried cameras, flowers, and wide smiles, filling the seats until there was hardly a place left to stand. Michael arrived early, dressed in his usual tailored suit, but this time he felt out of place rather than powerful. Around him were parents in worn jackets, mothers carrying babies on their hips, and fathers with tired eyes from long shifts. He sat quietly in the front, realizing that despite his immense wealth, he had something in common with all of them: the nervous anticipation of watching his child step onto a stage. When the performance began, Michael watched as children recited rhymes and sang songs, their parents cheering loudly. Then came Emily and Daniel. Emily wore a pink dress patterned with little flowers, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity her face wasn't shadowed with sadness. She looked nervous, glancing toward Michael, and when she spotted him in the front row, she smiled, small but unmistakable. Daniel stood beside her in his simple gray shirt with the faded dinosaur print, holding a cardboard prop they had made together. They began their short skit about a lost bird finding its way home, with Emily playing the bird and Daniel the child who helped guide it. At first her voice trembled, but Daniel whispered something that the audience couldn't hear, and suddenly she laughed, a clear sound that carried across the room. The children continued their performance, and Emily grew more confident with every line, while Daniel's steady presence anchored her. When they finished, the audience applauded warmly, but Michael barely heard it. He was too focused on his daughter, who was laughing and clapping her hands with Daniel as though the shadows that had haunted her had finally lifted. Tears pricked Michael's eyes, and he wasn't the only one. He noticed Daniel's mother in the back, clapping with pride, her tired face glowing with love for her son. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment they shared an unspoken understanding. She knew what her son had done for Emily, and he knew what her son meant to both of them. It was as if the two families, separated by class and circumstance, had collided in a way neither could have predicted but both silently acknowledged. After the show, children spilled into the hallways, hugging their parents and eating cookies set out on plastic plates. Emily ran to Michael, her cheeks flushed with excitement, and said breathlessly, "Daddy, did you see? Daniel made me brave." She wrapped her arms around his waist, and Michael knelt to hold her close, his heart swelling with gratitude and something else he couldn't yet name. He whispered, "I saw, sweetheart. You were wonderful." Emily then darted back to Daniel, tugging him over to Michael and saying proudly, "Daddy, this is my best friend." Michael extended his hand to the boy, but Daniel shook his head with a grin and gave him a small wave instead, unbothered by formality. Michael laughed softly, realizing the boy's strength came not from trying to fit into anyone's world but from remaining fully himself. As he watched Emily and Daniel run off to share cookies, Michael felt an overwhelming mix of awe and humility. He had built empires, signed deals worth billions, and commanded boardrooms, yet none of those victories compared to the sight of his daughter laughing freely because of a boy who had nothing but his heart to give. That night, as Michael tucked Emily into bed, she whispered drowsily, "Daddy, I think Mommy would have liked Daniel." The words pierced him, not with pain but with a deep, healing truth. He stroked her hair gently, his voice low as he said, "I think she would have loved him, too." Long after she fell asleep, Michael sat in the quiet of her room, watching her chest rise and fall, his thoughts returning again and again to Daniel. The boy wasn't just Emily's friend. He was becoming the reason Michael began to see the world, and his daughter, through a new lens, one that carried both hope and responsibility. Weeks passed after the showcase, and life began to take on a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its warmth. Emily laughed more often now, sometimes at Daniel's silly jokes, sometimes just at the small joys of being a child again, and each time Michael would watch with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He often found himself lingering at the kindergarten longer than before, talking with Daniel's mother while the children played, and through those conversations he began to understand the weight she carried every day. She worked long hours at a diner, lived paycheck to paycheck, and yet managed to raise a boy who was braver and kinder than most adults Michael knew. He was humbled by her strength, and quietly ashamed of how long he had believed that wealth alone could protect his daughter from pain. One evening, when Emily asked if Daniel could come over for dinner, Michael felt a flicker of hesitation. He had never opened his home to anyone outside his own circle, but the excitement in her eyes left no room for refusal. Daniel arrived in his worn jeans and dinosaur shirt, his mother offering a polite but uncertain smile as she dropped him off. Inside the vast mansion, Daniel walked slowly, taking in the towering ceilings, the polished floors, and the shelves filled with books and photographs. Michael expected the boy to be intimidated, but instead Daniel treated it all with the same matter-of-factness he carried everywhere, as though these walls and riches were no more extraordinary than the small apartment he lived in. It struck Michael deeply, because he realized that Daniel's strength came not from pretending to be more, but from being exactly who he was. During dinner, Emily and Daniel laughed so hard that food nearly spilled from their plates, and Michael found himself laughing along, the sound strange to his own ears after so many quiet, somber meals. For the first time since his wife's passing, the house felt alive. Later, as Emily showed Daniel her toys and books, Michael sat with Daniel's mother in the living room, and she confessed how hard it had been raising a child alone. There was no bitterness in her words, only honesty, and Michael listened with a respect he hadn't offered anyone in years. By the time she left that night, he felt something shift in his chest, an awareness that perhaps his family's healing was tied not only to Daniel but to the strength of the woman who had raised him. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon Michael received a call from the kindergarten. Daniel had been bullied by older kids on the playground, and Emily had rushed to defend him. By the time Michael arrived, Emily was sitting with Daniel, her arm around him, whispering that everything would be okay. Michael watched them, pride swelling in him, but also a deep realization. His daughter, once so broken, was now capable of standing strong for someone else, because Daniel had shown her how to be brave. The boy had not just given her laughter, he had given her courage. That night Michael stood in his study, staring at a photograph of his late wife, and whispered, "He saved her. A little boy with nothing saved her. I can't ignore that." His voice cracked as he admitted the truth aloud. Emily was whole again, not because of money, not because of professionals or careful strategies, but because of friendship, love, and the kind of goodness that no wealth could ever buy. He decided then that Daniel and his mother would never be left to struggle alone again. Weeks later, Michael sat with Emily and Daniel in the garden, the spring air alive with the scent of flowers. Emily was braiding daisy chains, Daniel was laughing at how badly his kept falling apart, and Michael simply watched, his heart fuller than it had been in years. When Daniel's mother arrived, tired from work, Michael surprised her with an offer. He told her that he wanted to ensure Daniel had every opportunity in life, schooling, security, and a future without constant struggle. She protested at first, proud and unwilling to accept charity, but Michael explained that it wasn't charity. It was gratitude, it was recognition, it was the only way he could honor what her son had given to his daughter. Slowly, with tears in her eyes, she nodded. As the sun set and the children played, Michael realized that his family was no longer just him and Emily. It was Emily, Daniel, and the woman who had raised him with so much quiet courage. It was a patchwork family stitched together by grief and laughter, by loss and renewal, by the extraordinary gift of a little boy's kindness. For the first time since his wife's death, Michael felt not only hope but peace. He understood now that happiness didn't mean erasing pain, but finding love and light even in its shadow. And with Daniel's laughter echoing across the garden and Emily smiling freely once more, Michael knew their lives had been forever changed.